Just disingenuous in some of these letters to the editor in the Kansas City Star. 8:05, good morning. Tirade Tuesday is a half hour away. That is your chance to rant about whatever you want to get off your chest heading into the office. And at 8:45, we've got your next chance to win Night at the Tower tickets at the National World War I Museum and Memorial coming up on Saturday, September 27th. Do not miss that. Right here on KCMO, part of a busy 8 o'clock hour. So, let's get to these in the Kansas City Star. Once again, these are letters to the editor, so this is not the opinions of those who write for the Kansas City Star, but rather those who read the Kansas City Star. And there were a couple of these that stood out above the rest. This one in particular comes from Suzanne in Lee's Summit. Suzanne writes here, Charlie Kirk's death is absolutely tragic, as were the deaths of Democratic Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband. Charlie Kirk leaves behind a wife and 2 kids. Representative Hortman and her husband left behind 2 kids. I guess violence isn't the answer, is it? Well, whoever said it was. And put a pin in that for a second. We'll get to more of that question here in a moment on KCMO. Suzanne then puts this out there in a letter to the editor in the Kansas City Star. If you pray for Charlie Kirk, you need to pray for the family of Melissa Hortman. If you were saddened by the deaths of Melissa Hortman and her husband, you should be saddened by Charlie Kirk's death as well and pray for his family. Okay. Yeah. And there's a difference here. And the difference is, and this is why the Charlie Kirk one is more meaningful and hits home for many more people. And I don't say this with any disrespect to Melissa Hortman, but nobody knew who she was outside of some people in Minnesota. I mean, most people in Kansas and Missouri couldn't name their state rep if they walked into them in a coffee shop. No one knows these people. You know, they go to Jeff City, they go to Topeka, and this is true in any state in the country, and they think they're really important when they're in their bubble in their state capital. They walk outside, no one knows who they are. No one. But Charlie Kirk had a following of millions all over the country. That's what made him different. So this is not an either or. Of course, you know, when we saw the story about Melissa Hortman, it's tragic. It's a story. You bring it up. But a state rep is not going to have the same impact as somebody who had a following in the millions. It's just not one and the same. It's not meant as a disrespect to Hortman's family at all. It's just explaining why one gets a lot more media attention than the other. And there still are a lot of questions around why that guy up in Minnesota shot this state rep and her husband. I mean, there are reports that he had voted in Republican primaries, but that he had no Kings flyers in his car and was appointed by Governor Tim Walz. Like, there's still a lot of questions around his motive and who he was and what he was and why he did what he did up there. But the Charlie Kirk one, we're less than a week into it, and it's becoming pretty obvious what motivated this individual. So that's why, if you think that, well, one's getting more attention than the other, it's not because of the politics of the person that was killed. It's because of what that person represented to a much larger group of people. And that's just a reality. It's not meant to be disparaging towards the Minnesota lawmaker. Suzanne writes here to the Kansas City Star at Elise Summit, prayers are not enough. We are living in a culture of hate that I don't ever remember experiencing before. We have to resist the hateful rhetoric and spread of hearsay to support our own feelings. We've gotten to where we can't recognize something as a tragedy if it happened to someone in a political party that we don't support. And we don't want people to think that we support that political party. That's tragic. That's not true. That's not true. It is true I didn't spend the time on this show on the Minnesota lawmaker as I did Charlie Kirk. It's not because she was in a different political party. That's not why. It's because no one knew who she was, And we still are trying to figure out the motive of what happened in Minnesota. There really hasn't been an update as far as I can tell, and I looked this morning on that story in quite some time. And let's be honest, too. The Minnesota lawmaker was an older individual. Not that it should matter, but there's added tragedy to someone getting assassinated when they're 31 and leave behind a young wife, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. Just emotionally, there's more there than someone who's 60. And maybe that's unfair. I don't think it is when you're talking about someone leaving behind a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, someone who never got to raise their children, whose children will only know their father through videos and through pictures. That's an element here as well that makes this story more emotional for millions of people. Suzanne ends by writing here, we could not be more divided, and it's never going to get better unless we work harder to really see and hear people. What are we going to do about this together? Well, the first thing to do is not write ridiculous notes like this to the Kansas City Star. That's the first thing to do. I know it's written from a standpoint of a holier-than-thou, take the high road approach, but it's really not, because it's insinuating that people on both sides are downplaying the other's death based on their political party and political preference. And the data would bear that out to not be true. In fact, it was part of the closing comments that J.D. Vance gave yesterday when he was hosting the Charlie Kirk Show. He talked about unity. He also talked about the violence that this country is going through right now. And I thought overall, J.D. Vance knocked it out of the park, filling in for Charlie Kirk when he talked about this very point and very issue.
I really do believe that we can come together in this country. I believe we must. But unity, real unity, can be found only after climbing the mountain of truth. And there are difficult truths we must confront in our country. One truth is that 24% of self-described, quote, very liberals believe it is acceptable to be happy about the death of a political opponent, while only 3% of self-described very conservatives agree. 3% is too many, of course. Another truth is that 26% of young liberals believe political violence is sometimes justified. And only 7% of young conservatives say the same. Again, too high a number. In a country of 330 million people, you can, of course, find one person of a given political persuasion justifying this or that or almost anything. But the data is clear. People on the left are much likelier to defend and celebrate political violence. This is not a both sides problem. If both sides have a problem, one side has a much bigger and malignant problem, and that is the truth we must be told. That problem has terrible consequences.
That was J.D. Vance yesterday filling in on the Charlie Kirk Show. And that's not J.D. Vance just giving an opinion here. These are the headlines from Yahoo News last week. Polls show rising number of Americans justify political violence, and they allude to the poll that J.D. Vance just talked about there. TheHill.com writes here yesterday, liberals more likely to say political violence sometimes is justified. You know, these are not like right-wing media outlets writing this stuff. If it is a both sides problem, and I will not deny that, as J.D. said there, 1% is 1% too many of either political side justifying violence. But the polling makes it very clear. From YouGov and some of the other major polling outfits, it's not like Bob's Polling Company, okay? These are major political polling outfits. That the issue is a much bigger one on one side of the political aisle. And that's why letters to the editor like Suzanne's and Lee's Summit to the Kansas City Star is wildly disingenuous. Any political violence is bad. But I'll tell you right now, if we're going to look at this and be real about it and try to unify, you also can't deny the data. And that's where there are certain people that are going to have to look in the mirror and say, what do I do about the problem on my side? Because, yes, 1% is too much, but we've got to get this thing figured out quickly, John.
If you're worried about a divided society, you might want to remove the "In this house we believe" sign.
Yeah.
See, I can help you fix your flat tire, buddy. Who'd you vote for?
Yeah.
What radio stations you listen to?
Mm-hmm.
You like country music?
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't need to divide ourselves. I can help you fix your flat tire. I'm just here to help you.
Yep,
Don't
that's
need
it.
to know any more about you.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. And, you know, the sanctimonious, holier-than-thou nonsense that you get from people who put up flags like that and put up their yard signs, they think they're promoting unity. What they're really doing at their core is dividing. What they're really doing is promoting their own elitism. That's what they're doing. They want to make themselves look morally better than you. But in the end, it's all about division. And that's sad. It's actually the opposite of what they think they're promoting deep down with some of that nonsense. And I don't know if they just can't see that. If they can't see the big picture of what some of those things promote, I don't know. But they're not doing themselves, they're not doing unity in this country any favors whatsoever. And it's something that's got to be addressed and has to be figured out. And the sooner the better.